So a lot of people, comment, they message, they email me, and they're like, Breeze, you're not really talking about all the horrible things that are, the awful things or the bad things that people say about the NHS. Why don't you do that? So I thought, do you know what? Where are you guys hearing about it? Where are you reading it from? Let's just have a little look-see. And somebody sent us this link, and I thought, you know what? I think the easiest way to actually go about answering this question is just reacting to the video. Hey guys, Breeze here. So the link I was sent was from this YouTube channel called The Aspiring Medics, and it's about a video that's entitled Why Are Doctors Leaving the NHS? So I just had a quick look. Obviously I'm not going to spend crazy amounts of time stalking poor innocent people, but from what I could understand is I think these are medical students who are helping individuals who want to get into medical school in the United Kingdom. And from the description box in the video it says, we interviewed medical students for this video. I'm assuming when they say we, they are also medical students, so it's like medical students interviewing medical students, but from what I could understand, no one in the video actually works as a doctor in the NHS. I could be wrong. I mean, we'll get into it, and maybe I'm actually completely wrong about this, because I haven't fully seen the video myself. I thought I'd just see it along with y'all and then comment as we went into it. So let us get started. So what I'll do is I will try not to pause too many times, but just if I feel like we need to clarify or discuss one or two points, I will do that accordingly. Here we are.
This is going to be quite a controversial video, and it's one that we hesitated to make, but we think actually it's quite important for the general public and especially for aspiring medics to know about. The NHS is in crisis. An increasing number of junior doctors are now leaving the NHS before even completing their training, and this is something that we're seeing a lot of conversations and debates about, especially on Twitter, for example. Another thing is even medical students, before even becoming a doctor, are actually considering leaving the profession, the very profession that they're training up to be at medical school. We're going to hear from medical students from across the UK on their insights as to why junior doctors are leaving the NHS. This video took us a lot of time, so I'd really appreciate it if you just smash that subscribe button and leave a like. And without further ado, let's get into it.
So I think my initial suspicion is correct then. It is, I think, medical students actually interviewing medical students about what they understand about others' experiences rather than their own lived-in experience, which I think can complicate issues a little bit, especially because not to, mitigate anyone else's reasons for leaving the NHS. I know there are people who are leaving the NHS on a daily basis or monthly basis. There are people who are also joining in the same manner, but that's something I think is a universal thing. People will join and leave healthcare forces around the world for whatever reason, and that's just kind of the ebb and tide of a lot of things. I do find that their little screen bit for Ali Abdul is not necessarily the best, I guess, argument in their favor, because from what I've understood from his channel, I mean, if you have a side gig that's earning you substantially more and you love doing it, and it's something that you find is lucrative as well as interesting, and you don't want to do your main job anymore, I would leave medicine too, to be honest with you. I don't think that would make a difference if I was working in the US or in the UK as a doctor, but let's see what they say next.
What most people don't know is that a junior doctor is any doctor that's not a consultant level. So that's all the way from when you graduate medical school as a foundation year level, all the way up to registrar level.
So I have one small point of contention with this example that they've given here, because I feel like it can be a little confusing. Because the way I read it, and then I realized, oh, maybe this is what they're actually trying to say here is, they're saying foundation years 1 and 2, and then they're saying specialty registrar 5 to 10 years. I'm reading that as 5 to 10 years on top of the foundation training, so that means I would have to at least be in it 7 years to 12 years before I could become a consultant. Because for the consultant part, they've said 7 to 12 years after medical school, but GP training is only 3 years, so I don't know if they mean 3 to 10, or maybe I'm just nitpicking, but I found this a little bit confusing, honestly, when I looked at it. But yeah, so foundation years, if you're an international doctor, you'll realize things might be a little bit different for us on this spectrum. And what they're mentioning about a junior doctor is, yes, that's true. In the United Kingdom, effectively, if you're not a consultant, you are considered a junior doctor. I'm not a huge fan of the term myself. I don't think it's an appropriate term considering our experience and our worth, but there you are. It is the term, however, that they use.
Anything before being a consultant. So the majority of doctors are therefore junior doctors, and depending on the specialty, you'll be a junior doctor, so when you graduate medical school, anywhere between 5 to 10 years, and that's again dependent on the specialty.
Since 2008, junior doctors in the NHS have seen a real terms pay cut of up to 30%. This means that junior doctors today effectively earn 30% less than what junior doctors earned 14 or 15 years ago. So how did this happen? So inflation is the general increase in price of commodities in our economy. So as inflation increases or as prices go up, wages or salaries should also go up by the same amount so that people can afford to buy the same things. However, over the past 15 years, as inflation and prices have risen, junior doctor wages have not increased by the same amount, resulting in an effective pay cut. Other issues like the NHS bursary, which is given to 4th and 5th year medical students, not being sufficient enough, have also been highlighted recently, and I would recommend checking out the hashtag Livable NHS Bursary campaign if you're interested in finding out more. All of this, along with the cost of living crisis that we're facing right now, means that junior doctors are not paid nearly enough for their efforts. After working really hard through the pandemic, many believe it's time to fight for a better future. And most recently, the BMA, or the British Medical Association, announced that a strike is inevitable, and the last junior doctor strikes were in 2016.
So, just to kind of cap on from what this individual said, yes, I definitely believe we need to have pay restoration, which is a lot of stuff that's been talked about and discussed on social media and newspapers for the last few months. In terms of cost of living crisis, it's unfortunately not isolated to the United Kingdom. Inflation is striking the countries across the world, and a lot of people are feeling a little bit more of a pinch than they had before. I'm not, again, mitigating anyone's circumstances, but it is something that I believe is a reality in a lot of countries around the world. I've had people say even in their own countries, that's the situation. People will argue back and say to me, well, this is, a first world country, it shouldn't be like that. But it's not, unfortunately, always true that with, inflation rising, that, people's pay is also increasing. There have been incidences throughout the United Kingdom where other individuals, other unions have gone on strike and their pay has been restored. And I think that's an important part of the process, and if doctors do that in the UK, that will be to a good end.
So one of the most commonly cited reasons for why doctors are leaving the NHS is simply the extraordinarily long working hours. So doctors are on average contracted to work around 40 hours per week, and this is going to depend on your specialty, your seniority, and a range of other factors, such as if you're working during the day or during the night. However, either way, doctors are very frequently exceeding these numbers by a long way, with a study finding that over 55% of doctors are doing additional unpaid work on a weekly basis. So this can lead to disruptions in your work-life balance, your sleep, and your relationships, with another study finding that only 26% of doctors consider themselves to have a good work-life balance. And this is further compounded by a very chaotic rota for a lot of doctors, which means that one day you might be working an early morning shift and another day you'll be working a late night shift.
Okay, so I'm sure you guys saw my face change quite a bit during this point. I don't know if they've cited this in the description box, but he cited two studies. I mean, he's talked about two studies without actually citing them, or like in the other parts of the video, they've kind of brought up headlines or showed diagrams, say this is what's happening. So I want to know a little bit more about those studies. One, two, he said that on average doctors work 40 hours a week in the NHS. Actually, we work an average of 48 hours in terms of on-call and social, unsocial responsibilities. If we're working a normal, basic kind of hours without any on-calls, then it would be 40 hours per week, Monday to Friday, 9 to 5 or 8 to 4 or whatever. So I don't consider 48 hours or an average 48 hours a week long hours. We have a video talking about the working hours in the NHS, and of course the importance of the work time directive, which came out of the 2016 junior doctors strike, which basically put into place basically a huge cap that prevented us from becoming like a lot of American doctors are, working crazy hours. I will tell you now, I have seen those crazy hours. I'm sure a lot of you might be sitting there having worked crazy hours in your own country. You might be like, wait a second, what is the explanation behind this? So he said, all right, there are people who are working extra hours that are unpaid, but I'm going to say this, and I'm not, again, trying to mitigate anyone else's experiences, but if you are working hours that you shouldn't be working, because of staffing shortages or something's happened, you've got to stay on longer, there are ways for you to say this so that you are fairly then reimbursed. I have had this happen myself. I've had to stay late for certain incidences, or we didn't have enough staff, and I put in an exception report and I was paid back that time. I always ask for the money back, but you can also ask for the time back if you want. So if you stayed, 2 extra hours, you get paid back. Maybe on Friday you leave 2 extra hours early, 2 hours early. So there are systems in place, so if something like that happens, you would get that time back. If you aren't raising those concerns, if you aren't complaining, then they don't know that there's a problem. It's literally as simple as that. So I'm not really certain where that kind of came from. In terms of work-life balance, I think it would be very important to understand, what are the range of individuals they're asking this question, how many people they were asking, what are their specialties, and what are the normal or average working hours, maybe even internationally, to understand what we are actually comparing against. I will say, I have always said, I suppose, that we've got a pretty good work-life balance in the United Kingdom, especially as compared to, my family in the US or my friends in the US who are doctors, or people I know in other countries who are doctors. I think, yes, you'll say, oh, Breeze, but you said it was an average of 48 hours. Yes, there are some weeks where you'll work more, but then that time is made up for when you will have your 0 days or your time off to, recover because you've put in so much work, so that it becomes that average of 48 hours. They've not really kind of said what those long hours are or kind of substantiated them, so I'm not too convinced by that argument, to be honest with you. But let's see what they say next.
The reason for doctors leaving the NHS is because of burnout, and that can be broadly defined by 3 main factors. 1, feeling negativity towards your job. 2, feeling exhausted because of your job. And number 3, having reduced professional efficacy, which basically means not feeling as if you can do your job properly. And of course, because of the COVID-19 pandemic, these feelings of burnout have only been exacerbated. Burnout is a really important issue, and it's something that actually is going to affect the majority of healthcare professionals at some point in their lives.
Okay, burnout is a reality in medical specialties across the world. I don't think anyone will ever tell you they don't experience burnout. So I don't necessarily think that is the only reason a person would leave the NHS. I do believe that's the reason a person might leave medicine, and that doesn't matter the country. People can get burned out regardless of COVID-19, especially in really, traumatic-y type specialties where they see a lot of stuff that will emotionally impact you. Now, the ways you can deal with that or help at least mitigate burnout is working less than full time, speaking to occupational health about modifying your working arrangement, speaking to your GP if you need stress leave, if you need time off from work because of that, because you are feeling burned out, and seeking, resources locally or even nationally about support for stress relief and for burnout. It's really important as well for you to know, like they said, even about reflecting, about understanding when you are burning out and what you can do, because you're not a safe doctor if you're a stressed doctor.
So, the NHS, a broken system. So, why are many doctors leaving the NHS? Well, I think it stems from serious staff shortages which have been sort of mounting in the NHS for years, and this has really been driven by the inadequate workforce planning and lack of government accountability, which includes insufficient funding and infrastructure to train enough new doctors. And we can really see this in sort of emergency units, GP surgeries out there in the UK. And I'm just going to talk to you a bit about one of the emergency units. So, Dr. Rob Parry here is quoted to say here, a lot of our staff are increasingly burned out, and morale is a long-term problem because we're not able to deliver the standard of care that we believe our patients deserve. And this can be reflected in the statistics from this hospital. Around 10,886 patients were waiting longer than 12 hours to be treated in A&E in that single month. And realistically, the target is no one should be waiting for more than 12 hours. And these are some of the worst waiting times in emergency units. We also have a lot of GPs wanting to lead direct patient care within the next 5 years. I think it's around a third of GPs in England plan on doing that. And a lot of representatives have been trying to urge the government to take action because a mass exodus of doctors leaving the GPs would cause serious jeopardy to patient care. And when we look at vacancies, official health service vacancy figures show it remains short of more than 9,000 medics and 40,000 nurses. And it's quite sad to see because a lot of hospital bosses are forcing last-minute shifts changes on junior doctors and trainees below the level of consultant up to the level of senior registrar. Because, staff sickness and scarcity of local medics has left them struggling to ensure patients' safety is maintained overnight. And this all takes sort of a really, really big toll on a doctor's physical and mental well-being.
I think that when...
So in terms of staff shortages, I mean, I've covered this in videos previously. We know that, yes, the NHS does need more doctors. They're recruiting heavily from overseas because of that. Things like the removal of RLMT, or the resident labour market test, has made it easier and easier for international doctors to come and work in the United Kingdom. In terms of an overworked system, yes, I definitely believe that the NHS is not perfect. I think conceptually, having universal healthcare is literally the best thing in the world, because why else are we doing a service that should be a basic human right? It's what it's there for. What the government is doing about it, I'm not necessarily in a position to comment, but I do think there are things at play that could be changed to allow the NHS to flourish. I don't necessarily know in terms of their argument that people are being forced to come in last minute. The thing about this is, let's take it for an example. If you're in a training post and you've come in for your morning shift, and they're like, somebody's called you up and said, listen, you're the only person we can contact tonight. Can you come in tonight and do a night shift instead of doing your day shift? Just go home right now. The thing is, you have the right to say no. You do. And I'm not saying it's easy. I'm not saying people might, not give you the side eye or say, well, why aren't you helping out? Why aren't you being supportive? Why aren't you being a team player? But you have the right to put your foot down and say, actually, I have training needs. I have training responsibilities. You can put in an exception report. You can speak to your college tutors, your training program director. You can raise it through your deanery that, listen, the staff shortages that are happening here are not my fault. They're not my responsibility. I have a portfolio responsibility. And if you decide to go ahead and pick up and cover that shortage, let's say, one of two things happen here. One, you're going to lose your opportunity. You need to ensure you're getting that opportunity back. Two, you need to see if, because you've now filled a shortage, are they actually considering the fact that they had this shortage that day? Because, if you think about it in terms of they had a shortage, they had to find a locum, or they had to look around and find a doctor to come and place it, fill in that space. They had to source money in order to do that. And there's a fund for them to know how many doctors are they sourcing emergency-wise as locums to fill in, the spot. If internally they were able to do this, that means it was at no extra cost to them. So is it actually then recorded? That might be a little misanthropic on my end, but that's why it's really important for you to stand your ground if you're ever in a situation like this, to say, actually, no. And if you are then that doctor who's working at night and it's dangerously understaffed, you have the right to put in an urgent exception report. If you are, for instance, on the medical ward and you're working overnight, you have a medical consultant who's also on call overnight, and they can be asked to come in if things are that short. So there are safety nets available. The unfortunate reality is we are oftentimes too reluctant to trigger those safety nets to make sure we allow the dominoes to fall properly. Instead, we feel like we need to put all the burden and stress on ourselves, which isn't right. It's not good for us, and it's not good for the system, because then, in a way, the system doesn't actually realize this problem exists.
When someone is studying to become a doctor as a medic, you're learning all this really detailed information. You're finding out the treatments, the management plans, the investigations for hundreds of different conditions. You learn all this really rich knowledge, and you feel prepared in a way to become a doctor. And then if you become a doctor and then you're stuck with sitting at a computer, ordering scans, ordering blood tests for hours every day, it just doesn't seem rewarding. There's no patient-facing interaction, which is what you were expecting when you spent all those years training. And so this sudden realization that actually you've learned all this stuff and you've expected all this patient interaction, just to have that not come to fruition as soon as you become a doctor can be rather almost heartbreaking, and that can really be behind someone's decision to leave the NHS, in my opinion.
Okay, so this is this person's opinion, I'm assuming, of what an F1 is doing, because he's saying it right after they become a doctor. I don't know how much I agree with this statement, mainly because, yes, I will not deny there is an element of what people call service provision in your job, where, yes, you will have to request scans, request bloods, and do follow-ups that involve paperwork, writing discharge summaries, but that's a reality throughout your entire, training or non-training when you're working as a doctor. I don't agree when they say that there isn't any sort of patient-facing care, because there definitely is. Even as an F1, you will do on-calls, and you're not following a consultant for your on-calls. You're not following a registrar for your on-calls. When you're doing a night shift, an evening shift, a weekend shift, it's you. You're there on the ward, seeing the patient, taking care of them. Yes, if you're seeing a patient and you're writing in their notes, you're typing up what they need, yes, you're going to prescribe stuff, you're going to request bloods, you're going to request scans, but that's part of the care that you're giving that patient. So it's not that you're sitting in a room by yourself and then somebody comes in and says, yeah, I just need you to do that stuff, and you never go see a patient, you never put in a cannula, you never do a procedure. There are certain niche specialities where you may not have as much hands-on experience just because they are super niche, but that's even true for you, when you're in a core level role because of how specialized that role is, and they're trying to get you trained up before you can actually do some of those things. Like, for instance, when I was in internal medicine training, there were times where I was, just watching the consultant do an endoscopy. But then it got to a point where they would let me hold the scope myself and I would understand, we would do sims and then, go from there. But there's going to be a process of you getting into it. I definitely don't agree with the statements at all in terms of you just sit in a corner somewhere and you're just, requesting scans or bloods for hours on end. It's part of the process when you're doing the ward rounds. I, at least, have always tried to do them with the ward rounds, just try and minimize how much I'm doing afterwards, because in case there are other jobs that needs to be done. But when I'm doing the ward round, I'm still with the consultant seeing the patient. I'm not just kept separate from everyone else, which is kind of what this sounds like.
There are many reasons why junior doctors are leaving the NHS. One of those reasons is due to a lack of senior support. Senior support can be hard to come by on wards and can lead to junior doctors taking on much more responsibility than they are trained for. Also, when issues are escalated, junior doctors feel like they're not being cared of or being taken seriously. All the while, they feel that there is little recognition from the NHS on their behalf.
Okay. This statement seems really contradictory to the statement before, because if you're on the wards without support, that means you're facing patients. So I'm not really sure how I feel about this one either. But lack of support means they don't know who to call sometimes, because I've seen that sometimes when I've been the medical registrar on call, I've realized that there's an F1 who's floundering and they just didn't realize it was okay to call us, because either they feel like they shouldn't have to call out, for help because they feel like somebody might think they're not capable enough, or they're new and they don't want it to seem really evident that they need help. And I get that. But remember, there is actually always a port of call. So if you're working in any specialty, most of the time people end up calling the medical registrar, and that's okay. That's what we're there for. We can try and troubleshoot. If it's, the medical registrar can't help, call your reg, surgical reg, obs, gynae, peds, find an ED registrar. When I worked in emergency medicine, there was never a time on the shop floor I wasn't finding someone, be it a consultant or a registrar, that I could go up to and be like, hey, listen, I need to run this past you. Yes, there are times where people will be busy, there might be emergencies, but that doesn't mean you can't find people if you go looking for them. Worst case scenario, if a person arrests or there's a medical emergency, there are ways in place for you to actually escalate and put out those calls, and then a whole bunch of people will come and help you. So I don't necessarily agree completely with it there not being senior support. I can understand why people will be reluctant to seek senior support. I can understand in certain hospitals there may be a scarcity of senior support if they are understaffed. But like I said, there are ways for you then to raise it. You can put in exception reports. You can put in incident reports saying we actually aren't able to conduct safe patient care because we don't have that support. And worst case, there are other ways to escalate, like I said, through, a registrar, through a consultant, through if you have like a hospital at night or an acute care team or an outreach team or anyone else that you feel would be that person for you to call, even if it's the ICU registrar or, even if you're not working in ICU, whoever you believe is your next port of call. It's important to know, because that's how you would then raise that concern to get that support.
The reason why doctors are leaving the NHS is because of the high competition rates, competition to get jobs, to get spaces. And this starts at sixth form, where there are so many applicants but such few medical school places. People often say that getting into medical school is the hardest part, but that simply is not true anymore, because getting into medical school is only the first step, and there are more medical school places than junior doctor positions. Recently, you might have seen that 800 medical students who passed their exams did not get the foundation job of their choice and were later accommodated in places that they didn't even apply to.
I just want to pause and say they were accommodated, and they weren't actually aware that so many people were going to apply into it, mainly because since RLMT has been lifted, an increasing amount of international doctors have been applying into the UK foundation program. That doesn't mean that's not an issue. I think they just weren't aware of how many people are actually gonna get that far. The UKFP later did release a statement about how there's a certain percentage of individuals who tend to withdraw their foundation application, and that's what they had initially anticipated. It would have been okay, they could have adjusted just fine, but I don't think they were prepared for this. Hopefully this year they'll be a little bit more prepared, but yeah, let's get back into that.
But the bottleneck doesn't stop here. There are more foundation year posts than specialty training posts, and more specialty training posts than registrars, than consultants, and so on. This bottleneck has led to so many doctors who have actually passed their exams to move on to their next level of training just stay in the same post because there are simply no training jobs.
So I just kind of want to say a little bit off of that. This isn't necessarily true for all specialties. This is a very, very vast generalization. The Royal College of Physicians just last year talked about how in the next few years there are not going to be enough medical consultants. And yes, there are competitive specialties out there in terms of there aren't as many training seats or training numbers. But as you guys have known from other videos I've talked about, there are other ways to become a consultant in the United Kingdom through a non-training route. And yes, training is something that a lot of people do aspire to, but it's not necessarily the end-all be-all. There are even a lot of local doctors who do opt for the CESR route. So I think that's something to really be mindful of. Otherwise, in terms of getting into the foundation schools, I also want to point out, as an international doctor, you don't have to apply for the UK Foundation program. You can directly apply into either a non-training job or a training job, as is applicable. They have not increased training numbers or training seats that much across the country, and that is true. I think that's something that hopefully they will look into and try and accommodate for. But I do find it interesting that they aren't increasing the training numbers, but they are very woefully aware about staffing shortages. So I feel like it's a strange line that they're walking between, because they know they need more doctors, but they just haven't increased those training numbers. I don't necessarily think, though, that prevents training opportunities, or at least the progression of a person to become a consultant because of that.
Imagine doctors who have passed all of their exams, gone through over 10 years of training to become a consultant, and then just simply don't find a consultant job.
Ooh, can I counter with, imagine all of the doctors who don't match in the United States after they finish medical school there. 8 years total, because they've got the 4 years of undergrad, 4 years of medical school, potentially maybe a little bit less if they do the 6-year medical route, and then they put all of that money, they're in a lot of debt, and they can't match. And in the US, you can't do anything if you don't match. There's no non-training route that you can take. So I don't necessarily think this part, the competitiveness, is isolated. Everyone knows how crazy it is in a lot of countries for a lot of different specialties.
That is what the NHS looks like right now. That is why so many doctors are choosing to leave and go to other countries where the competition isn't as high and where they're guaranteed a job as long as they complete their training.
I wonder why they haven't said what countries those are. Because again, even in the United States, if you're an international doctor, even if you've completed residency or fellowship, that doesn't guarantee you a job. Especially if a lot of you, this is anecdotal of course a little bit, because I've not had to think about visas for the United States, but I've understood, at least from some of my friends and colleagues, that the ways and the types of visas that they put you on, you might actually have to return back to your country and do kind of like a cooling off period before you can come back. Or sometimes they don't want to sponsor you any further, because not all the visas in the US are immigrant visas. Like, in the United Kingdom, if you're here for 5 years on your working visa, you can apply for indefinite leave to remain, but that's not necessarily the case in the United States. So
another reason that junior doctors are leaving the NHS is due to the location barriers. The lack of location flexibility means that locations can sometimes dictate what kind of specialties junior doctors are going into. If they're unable to move or require some stability in their early careers, it may be difficult for them to move their entire lives to a new area for a specialty that they would like to practice. Additionally, if they get placed in a larger deanery, it may be difficult to travel to and from hospital placements in a safe or appropriate manner.
So they've put moving across the country, but I think appropriately, as she's actually said here, is moving across deaneries. You don't move across a country in your rotation. So if you look at the deanery map, you'll actually understand how everything's kind of broken up, and there's some deaneries that are really big and some deaneries that are really small. And yeah, if a deanery is really large, depending on what your rotation, your placement is, you might have to move every year, and maybe that's an hour away from each hospital, like you're about an hour away each time. The ways you can mitigate this, of course, is when you are ranking your specialties to not choose areas that you know will be covering a wide base of space. When I applied for internal medicine training, that's why I didn't apply for Yorkshire and Humber, because I saw how the rotations work, and I was just like, no, I don't want to be moving like that. And in fact, where I ended up taking my internal medicine training, the reason was because I stayed in the same hospital for 3 years, and I didn't rotate at all. So that is also a reality. You may not have to move, or you don't move that much, or you don't move that far. But rotating through hospitals is not a UK specific thing. I did a video where I talked with my sister who was doing her internal medicine residency in the United States, and she was also moving through hospitals sometimes on a weekly basis. Like 1 week she was in one hospital, or another month she was in another hospital, which is definitely not the case, at least in the United Kingdom. You're finishing in one hospital and then you move into another hospital. So that I won't say is necessarily unique to the UK. I'm not saying it's a perfect system. And there are things that have happened, I know, where people have gotten into areas they didn't want to get into, or it's been difficult for them to get accommodated into. But I'm not, well versed enough to talk about that at length. I just want to say there are ways for you to stay in one area if you do a non-training job. And you might be like, well, what if I don't want to do a non-training job? Or what if that non-training job actually is not available because of the type of specialty there is? Totes understand. Just saying there are ways to kind of get around this. In terms of rotations throughout the deaneries, you can see how far apart they are, and you can try and find a central place to live and then try and see how you can get there. But like I said, there also are some places where you don't really move around that much, or you just move in an infrequent manner. So it's not all bleak.
So I think one of the reasons why doctors could be leaving the NHS is because of the lack of perks that come with the job. I know a lot of employers that medics typically go to offer things like house, travel insurance, all the insurance is covered for, they get credit cards, they get gym memberships, just to name a few. And the list is really extensive, whereas with the NHS, despite working in a healthcare system, you're not getting any healthcare benefits, there's no private health insurance.
I kind of want to say I feel like the reason maybe they don't, I'm not saying it's not a good idea that they don't give us private healthcare, but I wonder it's because maybe they feel then we also don't have faith in the NHS, that's why they don't want, I don't know. I'm not sure how I feel about that, but the thing I will say is that the NHS is a government organization, and it's kind of a thing, isn't it? The government organizations don't necessarily cover you the way that private organizations will. But let's hear what they've got to say.
Or anything like that. So it's easy to see why that could be behind someone's decision to leave the NHS.
So I think that's a really, really short reason just to say that private companies offer a lot of things and a government organization doesn't, so I'm going to leave the NHS, especially because the NHS does offer a lot of other things. There are a lot of places where I can get an NHS discount. It could be varying percentages. I just show them here's my hospital ID, NHS discount, thank you very much. In the pandemic, I know everything wasn't perfect for us, but at least there were situations where if I needed to get groceries, they were like, this is, protected time for NHS staff, which I thought was really nice because I was doing weird hours, sometimes late at night or early morning would be my shopping time, and I was able to get stuff done during that time. And in terms of, salary sacrifice for like your car, there's a car scheme for that. There are a lot of other things that potentially I'm not 100%, fully sure on, but I have seen and read about. And there's one perk that I always thought was very good, which is the NHS pension. And arguably, I've always heard people say that it's the best pension you can get out there, even better than private pension. So I will say, if that's not a good perk, then what is?
Private practice, the dark side of medicine. Something that isn't as well known is that only consultants can actually practice privately, and whether doctors should practice privately is something that we'll cover in a later video. What I do want to cover though is that for junior doctors it's something that's not available to them.
Ooh, no, I have some friends who are RMOs, or even medical officers in private hospitals. So I'm not sure about why they've said that. So private practices on their own, typically, yes, you are a consultant. You've got to have a good background and standing, and then people are like, yes, we'll come to you privately, and usually most people are affiliated with a NHS hospital as well. So people have a private practice and they have their NHS practice, or if you're in a really good area, you might have a complete private practice, especially GPs have a lot of private GPs. Now, the likelihood of you as someone who is not a specialist, who's not a consultant, trying to open a specialist clinic, I mean, if you are still in training and you haven't completed any sort of training, what would you be holding your private practice open for? What would you be doing in those roles? I don't know. I know there are some people who supplement their time by working in private clinics in other ways. Either they completely do private care as RMOs or medical officers, and they have whatever schedule they have working there outside of the NHS, or there's some people who will work part-time with their NHS work, doing stuff in private clinics like, Botox or et cetera, and other kind of stuff like that. But I don't think that's necessarily true to say that you can't at our level find private work. You definitely can. There have been people who have done that.
Junior doctors can't practice privately, but what they can do is actually locum. Locuming is where a doctor can basically work temporarily and fill any gaps on a rota basis, any shortages that exist. Locuming pays relatively well compared to salaried doctor, but it comes with a variety of cons, and that includes either feeling isolated, not supported, and also having irregular work schedules.
So I think that kind of also depends a little bit in terms of locum work, because if you are someone who can take a contractual locum, if you work with a bank within your own hospital, and you locum all the time, so if you're a pure 100% locum, then it won't be as much of an issue because you already know the place that you're working in. A lot of hospitals will even say, listen, we need a 9-to-5 doctor in this department, and we'll pay you locum pay for that if you stick around for a year, so you've got a job every day. Others who are on the bank, a lot of hospitals will email them first, like, hey, listen, we need some doctors here or there. Can you fill up that locum? Locum rates, like you said, it's very good, yes, depending on your experience. So if you're a reg, you'll get paid better than you would if you were an SHO and so forth. But locum pay is good. Locum work is also good. If you're an international doctor, you can't be a full-time locum unless you already have a settled visa status, so you don't need like a work visa. You can, however, locum otherwise, like on your annual leave, like when you're on vacation, or on the weekends, so long as you're not messing with your work time directives, so you're not overworking or you're not working too many long hours. But yeah, locum pay is real nice.
A survey of doctors leaving the NHS has sadly found that bullying is still a major issue for a significant number of doctors in the NHS. And we can speculate that this might be because the NHS operates on a hierarchical system, where on your team there will be people who are superior to you, and there will be doctors who will abuse this in order to make other doctors feel uncomfortable. There are also interestingly differences between different specialties. So, for example, obstetrics and gynecology has one of the highest percentages of bullying among those doctors leaving NHS. In addition, doctors who have been identified to have a fitness to practice issue in the past also report much higher levels of bullying. So the difficulty lies in how do you address this? You're operating within a nationwide system, and yet bullying is an individual problem on a case-by-case basis. So this sadly is a problem that remains unsolved. In addition to bullying, abuse from patients and the general public remains a problem, with doctors frequently reporting cases of sexual harassment and other forms of harassment as well, which can majorly impact your general well-being as a doctor.
So I just want to say, as my, I suppose, declaration of interest, that I've worked as a Freedom to Speak Up guardian for 2 years at my hospital, and I've definitely heard a lot of people talk about bullying. And my role is to try and mitigate that type of bullying. The whole reason the Freedom to Speak Up Guardian exists was because of this, that they realized this was a problem, and there was now, this is their way of saying, this is how we can try and understand what's happening and how we can kind of prevent it from happening. I'm not going to say bullying has disappeared overnight. I think we all know bullying exists in various forms throughout the world, no matter what your setting is, and it's an unfortunate reality. I kind of want to say I don't feel the NHS is necessarily as hierarchical as I've seen, for instance, like the US working environment for doctors, or even when I was an intern or worked as a medical student, or was a medical student in Bangladesh. I definitely felt like that structure was much more hierarchical. Like I could not say anything to a consultant without potential backlash or somebody getting really angry. And I think it is a little specialty specific, but I have felt that consultants as a whole are more approachable in the NHS. I've had coffee with my consultants, and we've had pizza, we've sat there, we've talked about little things and, mundane things, and just had a normal conversation, which wasn't something I was able to do, in a previous role. So maybe my take on it is a little different. In terms of abuse from patients, again, not something sadly that's isolated. to the NHS. I do know in my hospital, and I'm sure it must be the same in other hospitals, that there is a red card system that if a patient is behaving in a manner not fit for, being seen, there are ways that keep patients like that from re-entering into the hospital, and they're effectively banned. How that entire process works, I'm not exactly sure, but I know there is a protocol in place, and there are things that flag up in the system if someone is someone who's been previously warned, and they've come back into the hospital again.
Relocating to practice abroad as a doctor is becoming an increasingly popular option amongst medics from as early as medical school. There are a range of reasons for doctors wanting to move abroad, including better pay, better working conditions, quicker training, more hands-on work compared to the admin-heavy job of junior doctors in the UK, and overall a better work-life balance.
Okay, guys.
Okay, moving abroad, ultimately your choice. I moved from the US to the UK. I'm not necessarily sure if I'm the poster child for the US healthcare system. Is, why are doctors leaving the US type stuff. But I do think it's your own personal preference and choice, so do what you feel is right. I guess now reflecting on this video as a whole, no one's actually kind of introduced themselves or the role, so I am assuming again that they are all medical students, and again I'm assuming their experiences that they've mentioned are anecdotal or things that they have read about. I don't know necessarily experienced, so I think that there is an element to taking kind of things like this with a grain of salt, understanding your own experiences and understanding what they are going through for sure, but also understanding lived-in experiences and understanding things that are practically explained is also really important. Let's just see how they wrap this up.
Guys, thanks so much for watching all the way up to the end. This was quite a controversial video, but we think ultimately it was one that's going to be quite worthwhile and interesting to you guys, the viewers.
Basically, guys, I think those of you who kind of see these videos or see things like this and you're concerned, I get it. It's a valid concern to have. I think it's important sometimes to understand the viewpoints of everyone and where they're coming from. I don't necessarily believe that my viewpoints reflect that of the entire IMG population. I'll never say that. But like I said, I put forth what I see and how I work and what I think is the way, is best for me. So live your life that way too. Maybe, like if somebody asked me, would you still work in the NHS? I'd still kind of be like, well, yeah, because I think it works out just fine for me. And I've talked about that in different videos, like why it's the best time to be here and all the things that are available to us right now. Do I think it's a perfect system? No, but nothing is perfect. You got to go out there and make the change that you want to see and create the differences of what you want to do. And remember to always know your rights, always know what your contract states, and always make sure you know where to go for help and raise concerns. I think that's probably the crux of what I want to say. But yes, I hope this has answered a lot of those questions that people have kind of been messaging us about I hear this or I hear that, and you have a little bit of an understanding of where everything is coming from and how it actually is. I know it's really difficult for you to do that until you actually step into the NHS yourself, but if you're on the fence, make the decision that's best for you. So until next time, please continue to subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Check out our Road to UK forum. Maybe you want to have a personalized guidance session. We can talk a little bit more about this, but until then, we will see you next time. Bye.